The capitalist class. Capitalists and their top managers own and control businesses of all sizes. In a strict sense, anyone who makes a living by owning a business is a capitalist, even if she employs only a couple of people, or even if he is self-employed and has no one working for him. But it makes sense to distinguish between big and small capitalists, to recognize the difference in power they have over their workers, in the market, and in the political arena. Bill Gates and Donald Trump don't belong in the same class as the guy who has a small plumbing business and employs an occasional helper when work is steady. In 2006, the last year for which these data are available, 26 million businesses existed in the United States. Most were small, even tiny. Almost 21 million, 81%, involved the proprietor alone with no employees. Of the 4.9 million firms with employees in 2005, more than half employed just 1 to 4 people, accounting in total for just 5.2% of all employment that year. By contrast, just 21,000 companies employed 500 or more people each. These 0.4% of all businesses in the country employed 44% of all people working that year. The Internal Revenue Service reports that in 2006, the last data available, 58% of businesses had less than $25,000 in gross receipts, and all these very small businesses put together, 17.8 million of them, took in just 0.4% of all business revenue. The overwhelming majority of these small businesses are sole proprietorships, which the business owner does not incorporate. Any business profits are mixed in with the owner's other income and reported on his or her federal income tax form using Schedule C. Millions of these self-employed small business people have working-class jobs as their main source of support. Their business activity is just another source of personal income, often much smaller than their job income. Sometimes a working-class person will be forced to connect to an employer as an independent contractor, as when a hairdresser rents a chair in a salon whose owner has complete control over work hours and pay. For tax purposes, the independent hairdresser is a small business owner, but the reality is quite different. On the other end of the scale are the incorporated businesses or corporations. Even most of these are on the small side. Of the nearly 5.4 million corporations operating in 2006, only 19%, 1.1 million companies, had gross receipts above $1 million. But the receipts going to this 19% added up to 96% of all corporate receipts that year. Clearly, it is appropriate to make distinctions among capitalists, separating big business from small entrepreneurs. No clear, bright line separates the small business of the middle-class entrepreneur and the big business of the capitalist class. A company employing 15 people might be big in a town of 500 residents. Its owner might have a respected role in the local community and its political and social life. But in a larger city, such a business would disappear in the scheme of things from the point of view of those who hold serious power. So there is no simple rule to differentiate big from small business. Any attempt has to take into account the overall social setting of the business. Still, the distinction is worth pursuing to get a clearer picture of the diverse interests of the business community. To begin, I call any business small if its owner works side by side with the employees and supervises them directly. This owner is in the middle class. The business becomes big, and the owner a member of the capitalist class, only when the owner no longer works directly with the workers, exercises control over the workforce through at least one layer of middle management, and becomes occupied full-time with running the business as a senior strategist and source of authority, largely removed from the production process itself. Again, there is no hard and fast rule to separate these type of businesses, but experience suggests that 20 employees is a reasonable cutoff beyond which a small business becomes big. By this measure, there were 639,000 big businesses in the United States in 2005, each employing 20 or more people. These were only 13% of all businesses that had any employees beyond the owner, but in 2006 they had 81% of all employees and accounted for 85% of the country's non-government payroll. The boards of directors, principal owners, and top executives of these companies form the capitalist class. They are no more than 2% of the labor force. Most of these businesses are big fish in small ponds, holding sway in a local area, but wielding little market or political power on a national or even regional scale. To get a handle on the scope of big business and the capitalist class on a national scale, we can learn from how the business community itself approaches the question. One way is to look at the Small Business Administration, a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce that provides technical and financial assistance to small businesses. According to the rules of the SBA, established by Congress, any business with fewer than 500 employees is a small business. This number indicates that the government views big business as a relatively tiny number of corporations. In 2005, by the standards of the SBA, there were only 21,000 big businesses in the United States, 0.4% of all businesses with any employees, and 0.08% of all businesses in the country. Yet they employed over 44% of all business employees. In 2006, this tiny percent of all businesses in the United States paid out 56% of the country's private payroll, not counting sole proprietorships. We can reasonably consider these 21,000 big businesses to be the national economic elite. Their directors and senior officers exercise considerable power, not only within the companies they control, but also in the larger society, which is affected by their decisions and opinions on strategies for investment, collective bargaining, and foreign affairs. Even within this elite, power is concentrated in the very largest financial, manufacturing, service, and transportation companies. At the end of June 2010, there were 7,830 banks in the United States, not counting the separate branches many banks have, 6,676 commercial banks, and 1,154 savings banks, not counting credit unions. Banks are typically ranked in size by the amount of assets each controls. Thousands of banks are small business in small towns, important there but nowhere else. But the 25 largest commercial banks had assets ranging from $66.6 billion, Northern Trust, to $1.6 trillion, J.P. Morgan Chase. They were only 0.4% of all commercial banks, but this tiny fraction controlled 68% of all commercial bank assets in the country, $8.17 trillion. Even among these very richest and most powerful institutions, power is concentrated in the uppermost tier. The 5 biggest banks controlled 56% of the assets of the top 25. Similar concentrations occur in farming. When we think of agriculture, most of us think of the family farm, the backbone of rural America. In 2007, of the 2.2 million farms operating in the United States, 28% were under 50 acres, but they accounted for just 1.8% of all farmland. By contrast, fewer than 4% of farms were larger than 2,000 acres, but they covered 54% of the farmland in the United States. In 2006, almost 60% of farms in the country sold crops worth less than $10,000 for the entire year, taking in a total of less than 1% of all farm sales. The biggest operations, with 2007 sales of $1 million or more, were fewer than 3% of all farms, but they took in almost 60% of all farm revenue. These lopsided holdings are more than matched in manufacturing. In 2006, 286,000 firms were engaged in manufacturing in the United States. Almost 3/4 of these firms were small businesses employing fewer than 20 people. Together, they employed just under 9% of the manufacturing workforce. At the other end of the scale, there were 4,000 manufacturing companies that each employed more than 500 workers. These big businesses were just 1.3% of the total, but they employed 55% of the manufacturing workforce. 94% of manufacturing corporations had under $10 million in assets in 2006, and together they took in only 7% of all corporate manufacturing revenue. But the 1,760 largest manufacturing corporations had assets in excess of $250 million apiece. They were only 0.6% of all manufacturing corporations, but they took in 81% of all manufacturing corporations' revenues and 91% of the profit. These concentrations of power dominate industries we encounter in everyday life. The top 3 soft drink makers, Coke, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper Snapple, have nearly 90% of their market. At the close of the last century, the top 5 music album producers had 84% of their market. 90% of the cigarettes sold in this country were made by 3 companies, while 4 companies dominated residential telephone service and so on. Over time, corporate assets have become increasingly concentrated, a trend that continues. In banking, for example, while the number of commercial banks dropped from 12,500 at the end of 1990 to 7,100 in 2009, the share of bank assets controlled by the 100 largest banks increased from 50% to 82%. The share controlled by the 10 biggest banks in the country almost tripled, going from 20 to 54%. Concentration of banking assets among the largest banks increased still more after the 2008 financial crisis, despite concerns that banks had already become too big to fail and threatened the stability of the entire economy. Given the stark pattern of concentration of business assets in the relatively few largest corporations, it makes sense to consider big business as a distinct force in the economy and to consider the people who run these big businesses as a distinct class with more economic and political power than others. The average board of directors of a big business operating on a national scale includes about 15 people. There are then a total of about 315,000 positions on the board of directors of the 21,000 national-scale big businesses in the United States. These are the senior corporate officers and the outside directors who represent major suppliers, customers, sources of credit, and other links to the rest of the corporate world. Most directors sit only on one company's board, but some sit on the boards of 2 or 5 or even more corporations at the same time, forming intricate patterns of interlocking directorships among the major corporations. One detailed study of the directors of the 800 largest corporations in the United States found that 15% of directors sat on more than one company's board. Taking these multiple director positions into account, we can identify 245,000 or so individuals who together constitute the governing boards of national-scale corporations. They are the captains of industry who dominate the U.S. economy, the 0.2% of the private sector workforce, who are the core of the capitalist class on a national scale.